Hello watch enthusiasts. Now since this year is the 60th anniversary of the Omega Speedmaster, I thought that I should talk about the most iconic of Speedmasters, the series of Speedmasters between 1957 and 1969, during which the Calibre 321 was used. And this is really the most iconic of Omega chronograph movements, and really has become an icon. So in this video I'd like to talk about the history of the Speedmasters which included this movement. The first Speedmaster ever made was the 1957 CK2915. And this was a watch which has, in terms of styling cues, remained with us in the form of the Speedmaster 1957, or 57 rather, which is of course a larger and very different watch, but it has retained some cues from this watch, which I personally think are wonderful looking. So this is a 39mm watch with a narrow brushed bezel, and when this came out in 1957, this was released alongside the Railmaster and the original Seamaster 300. So that set of watches really do form a holy trinity of Omegas, really. And if I were to be collecting Omegas, I would love to have those three. Now, of course, all three of these watches have broad arrow hands, which are also my favourite hands from Omega, and have been revived in the form of the Seamaster 300 and Speedmaster 57. But in this case, this watch came with that 39mm case with those symmetrical lugs, and without any guards over the crown or pushers. This watch came with the Calibre 321, which was designed in the early 40s by Omega and Lemania, and it was a very robust movement. And this watch was originally designed for sports car racing, hence the tachymeter on the edge of the crystal. Incidentally, this watch and its bezel did in fact predate the Rolex Daytona, and therefore means that this watch was the first watch to ever have an external tachymeter around the bezel of the watch, not under the dial, which I think removed the clutter from the watch. But I know that early complaints on this watch were that the bezel wasn't easily read in the light, and also that broad arrow hand would often obscure the subdials. But this did have a manually wound calibre, and interestingly, it didn't actually have any waterproofing around the pushers. Now, the dial itself had recessed subdials for the sub registers for the chronograph, and these weren't loomed with any form of luminescent paint, whereas the broad arrow hands and the dial was loomed with radium. Now, the movement was actually very robust in this watch, in that it was shock protected by a soft iron core, as well as the fact that it was quite heavily shock resistant, which was again a testament to what a good movement this was, with a column wheel clutch. Other things to note is the fact that the subdial registers actually have the alpha style hands, which were later seen on the central dial of Speedmasters. Now, these watches are probably the most sought after Speedmaster reference, and these days will command prices around the £30,000 mark. Which is quite remarkable, really, for such a simple watch, and yet it really was an icon and still is. But frankly, if in terms of pricing, one can say that an original Seamaster looks like good value compared to this watch. Now, the second Speedmaster to be produced came out in 1959, and this replaced the CK2915. And this was really an all-round replacement in terms of developments and adjustments, and this was the 2998. This featured a real overhaul and was, I think, the first of the Speedmasters which look very much like a modern Speedmaster. And of course this model, the CK2998, has been recreated with the first Omega in space, and then again with the more recent blue version of that watch. Now, in terms of changes, this watch retained the 321 movement, but now it had a redesigned handset. So it had white painted alpha-style sub-register hands, as well as a larger and more prominent second hand on the chronograph, which, depending on the model you had, either had a circular loom, lollipop-style loom pip, or simply was a straight hand. The normal hands were alpha-style hands with loom at their centres, which I think are more legible than the arrow pointer-style hands, the broad arrow ones, on the basis they don't obscure the smaller sub-registers. Around the side of this watch there was also a new tachymeter, and this was a new painted black tachymeter, rather than the previous brushed steel versions. Now, the reason for this was because Firstly, Omega felt that it was more legible, and this was something that was pointed out with the original by various racing drivers and people using the watch, that it wasn't terribly legible in the light. So as a result, they changed over to this darker style, which was far more legible to glance. One interesting addition to this watch that wasn't on the previous version was improved waterproofing. And the reason for this on this watch was that they added O-rings around the pushers of the chronograph, which greatly improved the water resistance of this watch, and made it altogether a more practical timepiece for as it turned out, astronauts. Aside from being slightly larger at 40mm to the previous version's 39 or so, the actual case of this watch is very, very similar, and does follow pretty much exactly the same lines. It's merely the bezel that extends slightly further over the edge of the case, and so acts as a little bit of protection for the case itself. But in fact, this watch is famous for being the first Omega in space, hence the name of the re-edition, and this happened in 1962, as a result of astronaut Wally Schirra taking his own proprietary Speedmaster into space as a timer. Of course, when this watch went into space, it wasn't actually sent by NASA and wasn't regulated for NASA's use. This was very much an off-the-shelf piece owned by Mr. Schirra when he went into space, so it was very much his own watch rather than something commissioned. And this did prompt NASA, though, to look into using chronographs for space use. Of course, the Omega ended up being the watch that was used, but this certainly is interesting to see that this watch drew directly into the professional, which has become a real icon of space. Now, the next watch released in 1962 was the 105.002, and this is a watch which comes in several versions. So it shares the same case as the previous models, including the same pushers and crown and the same bezel, though I'll get onto the bezel in just a second. The real difference here is the handset. Now, the first set of these watches, from what I can gather, had the same alpha-style hands, but on the subdials had these small straight hands like one would expect on a more recent professional. And these were more legible and were more in keeping with a sharp aesthetic that Omega were going for. The chronograph second hand also featured a military-style lume plot, or in this case radium or tritium, in this case radium, in fact, placed at the tip to increase legibility in the dark. Now, the change in bezel was the fact that now there were several options for what you could have on that bezel. There was either simple tachymeter, or one could have something like a telemile or a telemeter to judge distances from time and rather from the time difference between sound and light. Alternatively, there were decimals for calculating industrial timings or making calculations. Or alternatively, there was a pulsometer to check your heart rate. So new options really for this Speedmaster. However, sometime in 1962, and I can't figure out when. I really have done some research, but I can't figure out the exact time this was changed. But it would seem that at some point in 1962, the same reference had the hands replaced, and they were changed from alpha hands to these straight-style hands, which really did change the watch from that more motorsports aesthetic to something of a professional pilot or astronaut's watch. Of course, this watch wasn't yet selected by NASA, but certainly this did follow a far more no-nonsense professional aesthetic. The next reference to appear was the 105.003, and this was almost identical to its predecessor, the 105.002, apart from the fact that the bezel had been enlarged and thickened to increase its legibility from 38.6mm in diameter to 39.7, rendering it more legible at a glance. But that said, though, I don't see these tachymeters as being all that useful on a daily basis. But Omega clearly saw it as as something to address and to make more legible. So one can see the continual evolution. But apart from that, it remained very much untouched in terms of its inner mechanics and its case itself. I think it's also worthwhile pointing out the hands remained that modern professional style onto this watch, and I think without this watch carrying on those, they wouldn't have made their way onto the final product. Now, this was the very watch which went through the rigorous testing that that was inflicted on these watches in order to test if they were suitable for NASA. And the reason why NASA was interested in doing this in 1964 was because they realised that astronauts were wearing their own watches, which could potentially be a dangerous practice if they were taking timings with something that wasn't necessarily as accurate as they would want it to be. Now, for this testing, 4 brands reached the sort of the shortlist, if you will: Omega, Rolex, and Longines. And of these 3, the Omega came out superior as the best chronograph of the 3. And really, when one thinks about the testing that these watches were put through, it's quite remarkable that this watch in this era could survive these tests. Now, to put the how rigorous these tests were into context, I'll talk you through the 11 procedures these watches had to survive. So they had to survive 48 hours at 71 degrees C, and then 30 minutes at 93 degrees C. Then 4 hours at minus 18 degrees C, and then they had to be to go through 15 cycles of going from 71 degrees to minus 18 degrees in 45 minutes at 10 to 6 atmospheres, as the air pressure inside the chamber varied depending on the temperature. These then had to go through a relative humidity of 95%, and had to be kept at this for 240 hours at between 20 degrees and 71 degrees C. Then these watches were kept for 48 hours in 100% oxygen atmosphere at 0.35 atmospheres, so less than normal air pressure. And then they had to survive 6 40G shocks, taking 11 milliseconds each, in 6 different directions. Then they had to be accelerated from 1G to 7.25G in 333 seconds, along an axis parallel to the spacecraft longitudinal axis. And then decompression of 90 minutes in a vacuum of 10 to 6 atmospheres at a temperature of 71 degrees C and 30 minutes at 93 degrees C. Then these watches had to be kept at 1.6 atmospheres for at least an hour, and then they had to survive 3 cycles of 30 minutes of vibrations varying from 5 to 2000 Hertz. And then they had to deal with noise as well, which seems like a rather alien thing to try with a watch, but even this had an effect on certain watches. So 130 decibels over a frequency of 40 to 10,000 Hertz over 30 minutes. Of course, these rigorous tests proved that this was very much the watch to be used by NASA in order to time their space missions, and of course this has remained the way to the present day. Now this is the 105.012, and this is the first professional, as released in 1964. And this featured very much the same Calibre 321 of previous versions, and the same straight hands of its predecessor. However, it now featured that professional case, which protected both the crown and the crown guards, allowing for the watch to be a far more robust model for sports appeal and uses. Now this was the watch worn by Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin on the moon in 1969. So this was very much an icon, and he's probably the most famous of professionals, because this retained those straight hands and that loom pip on the second hand, and that classic anodized black tachymeter to great effect to make a watch which has become truly iconic. Now technologically, apart from the redesigned case, not much changed apart from the inscription of professional on the dial. Also, this watch now featured membranes within the or behind the pushers to increase the water resistance once more, because of course pushers are really the most obvious point of ingress of water, and this watch had a single-stepped case back. The interesting thing is, though, before the moon mission, this watch was replaced in 1968 and 1969 by a later version. Now, the version of this watch worn by astronaut Michael Collins, who was the one who remained in the service module during the Apollo 11 space mission, was the 145.0112, and this version was released in 1968 and was a later model. The only real change was the case back, but the reason why, or at least the reason why they think that he had a different serial number and a different version of the watch, was the fact that he was issued his watch later by NASA, whereas the watches issued to the rest of the party were from a previous batch received by NASA. So on that basis, he had a different watch. And And it's sort of interesting, really, that the older version would make its way to the moon, but I suppose that's just one of those quirks of time. But the only difference here was the fact that this has a double-step case back, whereas the previous version has a single-step. But apart from that, the watches are pretty much identical. So anyway, I shall end there, as this is the last watch in the Omega Speedmaster lineup that kept the 321 calibre, before going to the 861. So thank you very much for watching, and do please like, share and subscribe to help the channel enjoy more content here. Also, do leave your comments down below as to which is your favourite of these Speedmasters. So thank you very much for watching. This is Arm on the Watch Guy, over and out.